I wasn't going to film this project because I thought that the material had been covered, but I wanted to just make a comment about what I found behind this late 70s modernisation. And what I wanted to talk about pertained to the inappropriateness of using glaver in these old houses. Glaver has made a lot of anti-cellulose fibre information on their website, and I wanted to make a comment about it because I use that insulation quite a lot, and there are several very good reasons for using it. Now, they were criticising it because they say that it held humidity, which glaver doesn't do, resulting in the K value being low. I'm sure that's based on some kind of factual thing, and I'm sure that's true, that when it's very humid it will have a low K value. And but I've seen the way that they do the testing for K values. I've looked into the whole subject of it quite in depth, and I see that it's really very unscientific the way they do it. And they claim to be scientific, but actually it isn't very scientific because they ignore a lot of the factors that are important in thermo and hydrodynamics, which of course in an old diffusion open building in a very cold climate, subarctic climate, the transport of humidity through the building's walls is very, very important. And on glaver's site they claim that discoloration of glaver comes from dust being collected from the air and not from humidity. It's not black mould. But, well, I just don't think that's true. I think this is humidity that's caused, has created black mould. And partly the reason why is because of the mice that run through it. Now, glaver is no obstacle for mice at all. In fact, they quite like it. They often make nests in it. I mean, I don't know if they have a very good standard of living inside glaver. I doubt that very much because it's very uncomfortable stuff if you've ever worked with it. But the fact is they make little channels through it. They're quite happy to live in it. They make latrines in it which make the house smell bad, and of course a hole through glaver like this brings in cold, and that cold here, you can see there's this dark area, and that is from condensation because the mice have brought the cold through, tunnelling out the material. So where the cold air has hit the warm interior, it's had condensation, and where there's condensation the fungus starts to grow, or the mould. You know, apart from the building being very tight to breathe. There we go, this is the little tunnel, and the one at the top there as well. And there's actually a mouse nest. They've brought in materials, they've brought in different materials to line the nest. So take a bit more out. And you see the channels run all the way through. And the area of condensation, you can see where it starts and where it stops. You know, it's quite clear that that's humidity that's caused that. It's not air coming through. So I suggest that the glaver's own website has got misinformation on it. That's obviously caused by condensation, which is collected behind the plastic, which you have to use, they say. So had this wall been insulated with borax treated cellulose fibre insulation, which is made out of newspaper or just trees, wood, the mice don't like that because it's too salty. They might run along the top of it, but they don't make nests in it. And the other good thing about it is that it absorbs and releases humidity at the same rate as the timber, which allows for a very even humidity inside the house. You don't get that amazingly dried out feeling that you get in modern houses. I'm going to make more videos about this subject because partly to defend my position on insulation, but also to inform people how to work with these old buildings in a sensible way. Now, in my opinion, the use of these modern materials with this modern technique, you know, it's very good when it's done from the start, but when you're trying to work together with an old building like this, it's just, I don't think it's the best solution. Now, this building actually, I thought this building was built in 1900, but it seems to me that this timber is much older. It's got the look of a building that's built at the beginning of the 1800s. It's 16 centimetres thick, 6-inch, nearly 7-inch material, which suggests that it's older. That has been an interior wall. It hasn't always been panelled, which is sometimes the case with the buildings that were built around the turn of the century, 1900. Now this has got panel from maybe 1905 or 1910, and the floor is also from that period, with the small gauge floor, maybe later. I mean, possibly that is later. It's got the blue paint there, which that's the lowest, the earliest colour of blue, which the paint on the walls there, which is linseed oil in a kind of blue, which was very popular in the 1920s for kitchens. And then it's had another layer of green, which was popular in the 1930s, and then an alkyd oil paint on the top, which doesn't sit well on the linseed oil, it just flakes off, in fact. So it's not again, I've made other videos about that, about the insuitability of the modern alkyd oil paints on top of linseed oil. Even painting with linseed oil is not easy, because it's you need to really scratch up the surface with 120 grit paper if you're going to get a good adherence. Now, there is some damage in this loft house, I see, but it's quite stable, and these pieces were put in whenever this work was done. If I say it was done in, let's for argument's sake say it was done in 1978, maybe one of the viewers recognises the materials. This blue writing on the material is quite distinctive, isn't it? Certainly no sign of a www on it. There's the use of clothes. Now, this is what I think is a sensible thing to do. That when these old buildings start to slip around and this line-scribed area gets opened up, it's better just to stuff material into it. I mean, I usually use moss for this, but you can use wool and old clothes to stop the drafts. It's really important not for it to be drafty. Now, here is a paper mache, which is also very old. That's been done well before the panel was put on. And then you have two sizes of window. This was all covered in and filled with disgusting looking insulation, full of mouse houses. And then here is an interior plank wall, which is going to be changed. That's yeah, it's pretty old. It's got some paper on it. That earliest thing was wallpapered, and there was a door going through to the other room there. So it's a little bit of newspaper that's used down in the corner to insulate, and that's been done well, probably it was done at the time when the boards were put up, and problem with the... This is not focusing again, this camera. I think maybe it's dirty, the lens is dirty. It's the trouble with having cameras on the building site. So anyway, there's a piece of newspaper there, and in it are the obituaries, and it states the two that I found with the date are 1893. So that's newspaper from 1893, and that puts us a good date. So it's 1893 probably. Unless the, I mean, people might have had an old pile of newspapers, I suppose, but I doubt it. It's certainly in the right time scale for the kind of panel that it is. Very good. So that definitely puts the house a good deal older than 1893, and as I say, it's probably from about 1800, maybe 1790 or 1780. So it could well have been moved here. It might very well have been moved here in 1893, but it's certainly an older house. So maybe the owner has some details about that. Okay, I'm not putting very much in. Don't want the earth really. Do you think I should describe what I'm doing? Why I'm doing it?
I think you should, yeah.
It's the secrets, Lauren. The secrets of the trade.
But it's quite interesting, isn't it, for people? I wouldn't have known to put that in. I mean, I know you can put it in between. Is that why you put it in between the
Well, it's
the
partly
logs?
insulation, and it's partly to stop the drafts, but it's also because it's antiseptic.
So does it stop insects coming, or does it stop them once they're already in there?
Don't really know. I think it's more the wet rot. I don't know really. But I do know that when I've taken out old, like this is pretty almost certainly at the end of the 1700s this was built. And when we've taken the pieces out of here, the moss that was in between the stocks was completely green still. So what's that, 200 years? And still green. And very often I've seen in the past it will rot, but not where the moss was.
Right.
So everything will be rotted except where the moss was. But in a way, I'm not altogether sure I want this on record. It's a bit of a hack, this.
Shall I stop filming?
I might keep it. It might be good for my own records. Still a little bit annoying, isn't it? Really. I think that'll go down if I put some screws in it. We've got those screws handy. Well, if it's high now, it's a tiny amount. But what's good is that by screwing that down there, that should be at least draft proof, if not antiseptic. Here I have an existing floor that's not level. So I want a piece. I'm taking out this old, some of this old floor, and I'm going to have a dividing wall here. This is going to show the beauty of using dividers. This piece of wood has a uniform size. know the slope, so it's higher here and lower there. So I can measure the distance at the top, the highest point with my dividers. That's fixed. And then I can just slip something in there, the right height, to get the same distance at the two ends. There are loads of different variations of that, so it just follows always the same logic. Now I want to get this piece of wood under this, and I'm going to line scribe it to the floor. Make sure there's nothing under there. Okay, so I want to line scribe that straight piece of wood underneath this straight piece of wood, and I can actually see the distance there. I don't need to measure it with numbers, I can measure it with my dividers. It's the perfect system for dyslexics. And now that that's in the same distance from the uneven surface all the way down, it's just now only a matter of line scribing to the floor. There'll be nothing at that end. Don't really do it twice, it's just have to do it once clearly, and then I can just fill in that little line I've made with this divider with pencil, and I'm going to chop that with the axe. You do actually have to split the line for this to work. But there's nothing wrong with trying more than once. Could just as well do it with a jigsaw as well. Kind of filling a little bit on the back edge there. But since the floor isn't even, it's going to take a little bit of adjustment anyway. And, I didn't do that on camera, you've seen me do that before probably. Didn't take long to do it. Fits pretty well. And the same principle applies if you're going to do if you're going to do something visible. I mean, this isn't going to be visible. This is going to be under the floor, so there's no reason for me to do it better than that. That's really good enough. But you could also use the same principle for doing skirting boards on an uneven floor. Works perfectly. Here there's a new ceiling and an old. I've taken out a wall at this point. So to strengthen up the divide between the new and the old, I've screwed this beam into the beam that's above. It's like a 3" by 6" beam. I used a Forstner bit and made plugs So that strengthens the beam above, but it serves another purpose. The old ceiling is slightly lower than the new ceiling. A slight unevenness. And by cutting this beam with a little step, so this side is actually hanging down less than this side. Once that's done, I plug the gaps between each board with a piece of wood, just a piece of dowel that fits in there, or a piece of something like that, licht it's called in Norwegian, just to fill the hole. The old ones from 1893 were done with cork. I put a little dab of glue on each little piece of wood, let that dry, and then the next day I have plugged or filled each of those little gaps with putty. Given it some underpainting yesterday, that's dried overnight, and now I'm doing the top coat the same colour as the ceiling, and it gives a really nice homogeneous surface which really makes the beam look as if it's always been there. There are several other films that show making this paint. I think one of them is called Window Restoration. Something to do with window restoration. Restoring a Norwegian window or something. So this putty is still wet. It's been here for less than 24 hours. And the paint, the undercoat, was just painted yesterday. But it's very hot at the moment, so I'm getting a slightly faster drying time than is usual. But this titanium white paint, it's mostly titanium white, it dries quite quickly compared to some other pigments. Black, for example, I think takes a very long time to dry. Some of the earth pigments take a long time to dry. But this paint is made from 60 to 70% titanium white, and then the most of the rest is zinc white, and then it's got burnt umber as the glass-fibre, as it's called in Norwegian, the break colour, the colour that just gives it a tint. I suppose it's a tint colour. A little bit of turpentine. But I'm painting, I would actually, if I was painting walls, or if I was painting the right way up, I might thin it even more with turpentine, but because I'm painting a ceiling, I leave it as thick as possible because I don't want it dripping too much down the brush. Obviously it's sensible not to allow the brush to go vertically upside down like that because it runs down. Linseed oil paint runs off the brush a lot more than industrial alkyd oil paint, which has chalk in it, especially to stop that from happening, and of course to make it cheaper or to make the profit margin bigger. But I'll have a second brush and I'll brush off the excess. frequently. Nejevne mellanrum is what came to mind. I've said it before in other films, but because I learnt to do all of these handwork skills in Norway, I think in Norwegian when I'm working on this kind of work, not in English. So I'm having to translate everything I'm thinking into English as I'm working, which of course is difficult anyway because I find it quite hard to talk and work at the same time until I get going, and then it's just a fountain of shit. So a few words of explanation. I don't always do this I think it's called mulling in English. It's called leaving in Norwegian. But this is a tint, a green tint. We're after something like this eventually, so it's going to be mixed with titanium white and zinc white. But the reason for wanting to grind this a little bit is to make sure that the pigment corns are of quite uniform size, so that they don't float around too much in the white paint. I want them to make a good homogeneous mix. I'm not really very experienced with this particular pigment. So I think maybe it's the first time I've used it for house paint. Green earth, terreverde. But I know that black tends to float up to the surface, so you paint it and then 24 hours later it's kind of darker at the surface. So I just want to make sure that doesn't happen here. So it might not be necessary to do this, but you get a finer paint when you grind it like this, which is good for interior work anyway. And I don't want to have to sand down the undercoat that we've done so far with the ground paint, just stirred paint. That can be sanded a little bit before this top coat goes on, but I don't want to have to. It's very difficult to manage to do this perfectly because it's a very translucent. It's going to be a very translucent paint, so we're relying on the homogeneity of the undercoat. So you can't really mess it up and do another coat because no, it just doesn't work like that. It's using the underpainting for creating the light. And I don't want it dripping on the floor either because I don't have very much of this and I need to have enough to do all of the walls. It's probably 80 square metres or something like that. I need to make probably 2.5 litres, 2 litres maybe of paint. 2.5 litres probably I need to make. But I don't like making such large batches because you can miscalculate by a massive margin using this kind of paint because it covers so well. So I mean the worst thing is if you think it's going to cover really well and then you find out that it doesn't cover quite well enough and you end up, well, I don't want to have loads left over either because it's expensive paint really for the customer. So as you grind it, you see you can get more pigment in to the same amount of oil, but I mean that isn't actually I'm not actually aiming for that now because I'm not making, this is the way you make artist paint as well, you see. Artist paint is very often very thick. At least it is now. I mean, I think in the old days the artists just used to make as much as they wanted, like just like this, because it was all freshly made. And then, you know, at the end of the 19th century, they started making aluminium tubes for paint, or not, maybe not aluminium, but probably lead actually, if you think of it. Anyway, metal tubes. And so some people started. Why did they just put it? They put, you know, some artists just were greedy and just went for it and put loads on, put loads of paint on. Got these kind of really thick paintings. And you think people have been very careful with pigment in all previous ages. It's always been considered something very valuable and something to be used with care, and it was an expensive thing to make pictures. But with the industrial age and the invention of new pigments to replace some of the older, more expensive ones, it became something that you could just squirt on the canvas. Which is, I don't know, I mean, kind of weird in a way. I suppose no more weird than something like the Eiffel Tower. I don't know, as soon as you dislocate art from spirituality, it becomes, I mean, especially if you use art in the service of kind of aggrandisement or the ego, then kind of anything, any kind of waste seems wasteful. I mean, it doesn't seem wasteful anymore, does it, to build great big things, expensive things. And it's not just in art, because, you know, you've got things like the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland or in France, wherever it is, that is CERN, massive, expensive thing. Enormously expensive, multiple billions of dollars. Well, there are other good things in science that are being completely ignored because they don't, I don't know, they threaten the status quo somehow, with all the stuff to do with electricity, the electrical universe model, which in my opinion is probably correct. Anyway, there we go. There's lots of that cherry root further there. I think that's probably enough to tint 2 litres. I've still got a little bit left. Maybe I should just do all of it. I like the idea of being able to have a little bit in reserve just in case.
I maybe think this brush looks a little bit small, a bit stumpy, but there's good reason for that. That's because I'm using a lot of pressure. If you use a bigger brush, you get very, very tired and nervous. I'm also doing it quite thin at the back there, because if the planks shrink in the winter and reveal a stripe, you'll be able to go in and repaint that stripe without having it double thick paint. Also, it allows the recess to be slightly lighter than the surface, the outside surface, which gives you more of a play when the light falls across it. I was a bit worried that I wasn't going to have enough pigment, but it looks to me like I'm going to have more than enough. This paint is covering, I don't know if I've used a deciliter, and I've got about 2 square metres. I probably haven't even used a deciliter.
This way of painting, it's incredibly important that the underpainting is being done beautifully, because every brush mark is kind of more or less visible. So if you've been sloppy with the underpainting, you can't do it this way. You have to use 3 coats to get a homogeneous surface. The thing is, I want it to be homogeneous, but I also want it to have to be a play. I don't want the paint to be exactly the same thickness everywhere, because it gives it a bit more life. And it will change a lot more with different light settings if the paint is quite thin, because it allows the light to go through to the white behind. So when it's lightweight, that white starts to really shine back. Whereas in darker weather, it will be it won't do that. It'll be more lively. So at the moment it's using about a teaspoonful of paint for each board. So I'm trying to replicate an older way of painting that was typical before the 20th century. Actually, it's quite typical before the Second World War, and that is a kind of understanding that pigment is valuable and that you don't need very much. Paint should be quite thin. So this paint does have a little bit of chalk in it. It's not a pure pigment paint. It's about maybe 5% chalk, and that's just to help with the consistency. When it actually thickens it very slightly. It stops it from running off as it's drying. It shouldn't be a problem now because I'm doing it quite thin. Now, strictly speaking, I don't need to use any turpentine in this at all now for this top coat because I want it to be more oily than the coat underneath to prevent the problem where the undercoat cracks. I mean the top coat. If the undercoat is more oily than top coat, then there's a danger that the top coat will crack because it will dry far more than the undercoat, and it does shrink very slightly when it dries. So when this paint dries, it will be matte. I suppose it might be silk matte. If you wanted to have a bit more glossy finish, you can put Damar varnish in it, which is pretty simple. Now after half an hour, 30 minutes, the turpentine has evaporated from the wall, and you can just, it leaves a slightly thicker paint there, which again is the reason for using the very stiff pig hair brush. Don't use nylon brushes for this because they're too soft. They leave too much paint on the surface. Yeah, brushes have been made the same like this for hundreds and hundreds of years. You just can't argue with it. They know what they're doing, people in the past. All of the different softer brushes have been used for all kinds of different paint. But for linseed oil paint, you use these kind of brushes. If you put this paint on too thick, it will literally just run off, like leave a massive curtain. Come back tomorrow and half of it will be on the floor. From this bigger area here, I'm going to use a gas mask because as soon as you start to get the larger area, it starts to get pretty bad. I've got a bit of paint on the wall, and then I'll start to brush it out. Don't need very much paint really because it's got one coat already.
I'll end with vertical stripes, but when I'm spreading it out like this, I go in both directions. There's no point in for me using a bigger brush than this because this is very, very sticky paint and it's quite hard work. If you use a bigger brush you just get tired faster, so you have to kind of use the brush that you can carry on with all day. It doesn't make a difference if you can't, if you haven't got the strength to use a bigger brush, there's no point doing it. Right, let's skip to the end now. Now this paint also often gets little bits in it, but there are several kind of brush techniques for just whipping out those bits from the surface, hairs and stuff. You go against the grain. No, I mean against the direction of the brushes, the bristles. You can pick up little hairs. I'm not going to film it now because you need to have a really good close-up on it to be able to see it, because these are tiny bits. And the bigger bits, they just drop out. If you just pick them up on the end and just flick it a little bit, they just drop out on the end. But because the paint is very sticky, it won't flick off the end of the brush. I mean, I don't do it up against a new painted wall, I do it on this bit that's obviously protected. And while I'm going in both directions, I just try to get an even surface layer. And it's a bit difficult to film it as well because it's, you know, the light is different from different angles and stuff. But kind of different colours become more apparent under different light as well. This is a pigment. This is a colour made from 3 pigments, or 4 pigments actually. It's 2 kinds of white, titanium and zinc white, titanium dioxide and zinc oxide. One is slightly brighter than the other. The zinc is quite good because it's kind of antiseptic. I tend to put it in a little bit anyway. You can't have too much zinc there because it's quite a weak. Makes a weak film and cracks. I mean, neither of them really replace the old lead white, which was much better, but it was very poisonous, so people don't use that anymore. And then I have three brushes, different sizes, just to do the different jobs. And I don't bother using tape. I just slow down at the edges and do it carefully. And then because this, for example, this little bit of beading here, moulding, is the paint on it is dry, so if I make a mess, it's very easy to get off. It's worse if it's wet on wet, but on a job this size, you can avoid that quite easily. So I'm just going to keep on working this a little bit, but the last thing I'll do is give the whole surface these downward strokes. The brush, the hair. So it's in the layer underneath. Alright, got that out. So anyway, like I was saying, these long vertical strokes with, I'm quite careful to try and keep them nice and straight, not to wobble, and that gives the surface a kind of nice flatness. Anyway, okay, I'm going to switch the film off now. They can't hear me anyway, can you?
The outside corners, they're alright to take with a slightly larger brush, but the inside corners really need to be done with a small brush. Right, and even now I made a mess of it, so I've got to clean up that corner. Clean that out, and then try again. There we go. And then back to the big brush. So I'm working quite dry now. The paint is I'm trying to keep it quite thin. So there shouldn't be too many drips. While I load up the brush with paint, I just gently pull that down over the surface, cover a large area in order to get that thicker paint off the brush. Because I like working with quite a dry brush. That way I'm kind of moving the paint around more rather than laying it just on. Because the whole point about this paint is it has to be done quite thinly. It's very economical paint really, although it's more expensive to make than buying a product. I think it's certainly not any more expensive because it covers such a large area. So I don't know, the pot of paint I've got here is less than a decilitre, and I'm pretty sure that's enough to do this bit of painting here. I don't know how many square metres this is, but certainly more than 1 square metre. But I have some different surfaces to contend with here because some of this is quite porous plaster, another is a surface that's previously been painted, and that's quite slippy. But still, if I just keep on working this paint out gently, and just, the last, you can't really describe it in words, it's something that you have to learn how to do with your hands. Because I'm applying an incredibly different amount of pressure for each action I'm doing here. Like these ones are just the lightest touch, just to spread the lines together to get rid of the light spots from because it's sliding across the shiny surface on part of this here. So I mean you could put a lot of words out there, and it would still not help the viewer learn how to do this by watching. You have to do it yourself with your hands. And make mistakes and learn from that. So I should say that the reason for putting this stuff on so thin is because if you put it on thick, it just runs off. It makes curtains, runs, drips. And the thing is, you think you've done a good job, you go away and you come back 6 or 7 hours later and it's all run off. Because it takes a long time to dry, especially when there's no turpentine in it. And when you don't have turpentine in it, what the general result is you put on a thicker layer. The point about thinning it is with turpentine is not so that it sinks in more. That's the other thing. That people always think that turpentine helps oils to sink in, but according to Jon Brenner, that's not the case. It's the size of the molecules of the oil that determine how deep they sink in, not the size of the molecules of the turpentine. Obviously the turpentine goes deep in, but it doesn't take the oil with it. The oil just goes to the depth it goes to. And here on masonry, that's exactly on the surface, because this has also already been painted before, but on woodwork that is just into the surface very slightly. They don't go very deep, none of these treatments go very deep. So there we go. So the reason for doing it very, very thin is so that it doesn't drip. And also you save paint. I mean, we've lost respect for these things. In the past, these pigments were very expensive, difficult to win from nature, to extract them from different chemical processes and mining processes, and then grinding them. It's a lot of work. And because we've industrialised these processes, we don't respect the value of the materials anymore. But when if you're trying to make a kind of authentic version of these earlier building processes, and for me, I mean, I have the same attitude towards the value of these pigments probably as the old workers did. I think they're valuable, and I think that, well, I value them myself, you know. I'd rather spend a few more minutes getting a good result with these things and use far less of it than use loads of materials just because I can't be bothered to do the work. So in a way I'm kind of using the excuse of being authentic. You know, there's a fashion for this authentic restoration these days, and that's lucky for me, because it suits me, this way of thinking about things, the valuing things which most people don't really value just because they don't cost very much to buy. But I mean, if you had to make this pigment from raw materials, you'd appreciate how much work went into doing it. I mean, I appreciate the fact that we've got the machines and stuff, but you know, a lot of the machines are paid for by people taking loans. It doesn't always pay off. Some companies put a lot of money into borrowing. They put a lot of effort into borrowing in order to have machines, but then by the time the machines have finished their life, they've ended up with very little profit. At the same time as you produce a lot, but what's the point of producing a lot if there's no real profit? Actually, it's a very bad thing because you end up by using up resources unnecessarily. I mean, none of this is necessary, is it? It's all aesthetic. Alright, babble. Cut that.